Hey everybody, it's Michael again with 4G Woodcrafts. I'm going to continue my build of the Evolution 4 by BobsCNC today. I did part 1 of the Gantry, which is right here, and I had some other stuff I was working on. I'll show you that in later videos with the wiring, but I'm going to continue with building the Gantry today. Alright, so I left off after putting the main part of the gantry together, and if you go through the procedure, the next part is the pulleys. So I've laid all my pieces out here, and the way you assemble the pulleys is you take your M5x30 machine screw, and there's there's 6 of them actually, but you take one of the pulley pieces. They're in 2 pieces, and you'll see there's a flange on one side that sticks out a little bit further. So you want that flange to go against the head of the nut or the bolt. And then the other side you put on the opposite side. So when you put it together, it will look like this. So you have the 2 flanges on the outside. That's where the belt is going to go. Those flanges help keep the belt aligned in there. Alright. So after you have those, then you're going to be putting a M5 nut onto there. Now, in the pulley bag, there's M5 nuts and M5 locking nuts. You make sure the first one you put on there is just the nut. And this is going to hold the pulleys together on the bolt. I didn't really, let's see. We can tighten it down. It doesn't need to be real tight on that part because there's going to be other stuff holding it on there too. Alright, so the next thing we put on here is going to be a fender washer. What I did is I laid them out in order of the procedure that they're going to be going. So you put the fender washer on next, and then you're going to put it through the Y-belt idler mount, which is this piece right here. So make sure when you put it through, you'll see how it's oriented. You have this little slot right here will be on the bottom if you're holding it, okay? And so if you're holding it like this, the actual nut part with the bearings goes on this side, okay? And then once you have I'll use one of these. So once you put it through there, you put another idler fender washer on there, and then after that you'll put the M5 locking nut. So that will go on here, and that is secured with an 8mm ratchet or socket or wrench, but it's 8mm. That nut is 8mm. So hold that on there, and then you screw it down. So I just did it until it's kind of snug. I didn't crank it down because it's going to need to slide, which actually I tightened it down a little bit too much because it won't slide. So make sure you don't tighten it down too much, because this will need to be adjusted like that. Okay. So the next part is you're going to need some painter's tape for this piece. Just like I did in my other videos, some parts of the procedure tell you to use it anyway. So just need a small little piece of tape. And what you do, you're going to put it on one side of this to hold the next pieces in. Alright, so once you do that, you're going to put a nut in, and you're going to put a washer. The tape is going to help hold those in. And then what you do with those on the inside and the tape on the outside, you're going to hold this and put it to where this little slotted piece right here is over that nut you just put in there. Alright, I was just looking at the instructions and I also decided to put a piece of tape on both sides of this. One thing I did notice with the instructions is it shows this in one picture on this side and then on this side for the other one. But looking further in how it actually installs, when you do it, you want to make sure the pulley is on the side where if you're setting it down flat, this is on the top right here. So it should be oriented like that with this up here. All right. So what we do is put this over that nut like I showed you, and then flip it over, and what you're going to do is take a zip tie, run it through here, and it'll come through a hole on that adjustment piece, and it goes back over and through the other side. You put that through, and then go ahead and engage the zip tie. And when you're working with zip ties, I use them all the time, but what you want to do is you want to have the flat piece over here, and you want to be able to pull it that way. It'll help you get it the tightest. So you tighten that, and you should see it stays on there, and it adjusts the pulley. That's how we're going to tighten the belt in future steps. Once you do that, just snip off the extra zip tie. Alright, so the next step is going to be attaching it to the gantry. And the way you do that is it's going to go on the side of it with the rail supports right here. And remember, I pointed out these holes show the bottom. And so if you're looking at this front, this is the top, this is the bottom, and this is going to go over here right into these slots right here. And then it will be secured. Alright, and we are going to secure this with a M4 screw and nut. Be careful when you're doing that. Make sure you don't damage anything. Alright, so the next part is, remember, this is the top and this is the bottom, right? So the top is up here. And the next part is going to be putting the Y stepper motor mount onto here. And just line up the holes, and you'll see there's a slot for an M4 screw and nut. Sorry, you can't. Alright, so once we have that attached, we're ready to start putting the sides of the gantry on. But before we move on, one thing that is helpful to go ahead and do, since I already laid out the pieces and I'll show you, is so these are going to be the bearings right here. It says to make 3 of them in that other step, but you don't need to make all 3 just the same. This part of them is the same though. So you put it on there with the lip on the outside, the other one with the lip on the other side, so there's a cave in there, and then you put the M5 nut on. want to tighten it down a little bit. And you can put the washer on there and set that aside for, we're going to need it here in a few steps. Go ahead and build the last one. All right, remember the two lips are on the outsides. Washer, go ahead and set that aside. Alright, so next we'll be putting the sides on the gantry. So we'll go ahead and do this side. And we made those in a previous step. And so if you look, this is looking at the front where the rail supports are. This is the left side of it. So it goes on there like this. You line it up. You'll be able to tell where the holes are. Just be patient and don't get too frustrated. Sometimes it takes a little bit to get everything to line up just right. Now the motor support, I can tell I have to push down a little bit. Just a little bit of pressure to get it to go into the slots right. All right. I'm just gonna snug it up a little bit. Make sure if you're doing this that you're very careful. Alright, and then we start securing it. Let's see, it has 7 screws and nuts. So whichever way you want to do this part, whichever ones are easier for you to access, just find the best way to do it that feels comfortable to you. Seven of those in. Make sure you get all 7. And one thing, you read in the instructions, the stepper motor mount, the one we put in there are 2 holes for that, but it says that will be attached at a later step. Don't worry about that. So it's just a 7 that attach it to the main gantry piece. Alright, so then what we're going to do is flip over the gantry and work on the other side. I think it worked pretty well the way I did it. Lifting it up is probably going to be the the best bet for getting this done. So I do know I have it started now, so instead of using all my strength and everything, I'm going to go ahead and use a clamp. I do have everything started in the holes. It just helps slowly guide it in there. Again, if you don't feel comfortable doing this, just take your time and get it in there smooth. Looks good. And again, like the other side, just get your screws, your M4 screws and M4 nuts into the side pieces. Alright, so the next step is to put the bearings onto the gantry. They're going to be here and on the other side. Again, just like the other bearings we did in the previous video, you have the bolt. The bearing goes on there with the flat side towards the bolt and the little tab that sticks out away from it. So it goes machine screw SG20U bearing. And then the bearing washer. I didn't pick that one up. Get the bearing washer after that. And then it goes into the plywood. And so we're going to start with the bottom ones here. So you put those in, and then you have the eccentric washer, which is the oversized washer that kind of fits on there loosely. Then you have the eccentric adjustment spacer, which goes in there. I try to point the mark at the on the outside indicator marks on there, so they're all fairly the same, and you put the lock nut on there. All right. And then that is secured by, yeah, it's a 10 millimeter and Phillips head. Snug that up good. Again, with the other side, does the same way. You got the bolt, the bearing, and then the bearing washer goes into the hole. You have the eccentric washer, and the eccentric adjustment spacer. Again, it goes into through the eccentric nut and the plywood, and then you put the lock nut on there. I don't know if it's necessary to adjust them to the outside yet, but that's just what I do when I install them. bottom ones, or it's actually tops because it's upside down. So the bottom ones go the same way. You have the bolt, the bearing, the washer, put it into the wood. Now this one, since they're not adjustments, you have another bearing on the other side. So you just have the bolt, the bearing, a washer, put it through the wood, another washer, and then the lock nut on there. I'll go ahead and put the last one on. Bolt, bearing, washer, put it into the wood, another bearing washer, and lock nut. And then we're ready to move on to the next step, which will be installing the idler bearing. Idler bearing, you can do either one, either side. They both go in the same spot. I'm not going to be able to do the bearings on the other side because I have not received those yet. They have been shipped, and I expect them in 2 days. So I should be able to finish up that part of this. But the other side bearings go on just the same as these two. So you have the idler bearing, and then you need the M5 lock nut. Alright, so to install the idler bearing, it just tells you to install it. It doesn't give a whole lot of details. But, so, if you look, let me turn this up so I can show you. Alright, so if you see right here, you see the big hole, and there's a smaller hole right over here. The idler bearing is going to go into that hole. Now, on the other side, on the inside of it, or the outside right here, you're going to put one of the washers that goes with the idler bearing, and then a lock nut, M5 lock nut goes on there. So to tighten it up, I recommend getting a ratchet with a long socket because it is tight in there. You can't really get a wrench in there too good. And it is going to be an 8mm socket to tighten up the idler bearing. Alright, and then you repeat that process on the other side. Grab the assembly that we put together earlier, you put it through that hole, put the washer on, and the lock nut. Alright, so that is the idler bearings installed. And again, I don't have these bearings to put on today. I'll get those on at another time. Alright, so the next part of the next step in the instructions is to install the Uno controller right here, which you can do. I'm not doing that step because I am running the wires to an external box just to keep everything outside of it, and I'm using shielded wire for everything, so there won't be any chance of interference. So the next thing we're going to do is install the X1 home switch. I'll show you how to do it on the X2, but what I have done is this is the wire I'm using. It's this is 18-2 shielded security wire. And so what I did is I cut the wires from the home switch, and I use solder sleeves, which are just basically shrink wrap with solder in the middle that holds it together. And I'll show you how to do the next one. But we're going to go ahead and put this one on here. Running the wires and installing this will be the same whether you have it or not. So this is the back of the gantry. This is the top, this is the bottom. So if you're looking at the front of the gantry, this is the right side. The home switch will go right here. The X1 home switch, rather. And you'll be using the 2.5 by 16 screws and lock nuts that come with it. So the way the switch gets installed is so it's going to go, let's see, give me a second. Sorry, I'm trying to get my bearings. Alright, so it's going to go through this hole right here. So I'm going to go ahead and feed the wire through there, just because it gets it out of the way to be able to mount the switch. So you pull the wire through there, right? And the switch is going to be installed just like this. All right, and you're going to, the screws, the actual bolts go from the inside, go through the switch, and the nuts will go against the switch. And remember, you just want to make them snug. You don't want to over tighten. You don't want to crack the plastic. It'll make the switch not function properly. Alright. So, if you have done that part, and you're using just the regular wires, it shows you a pretty good picture in the manual, but you're going to want to put a zip tie to hold it right here, right by the switch, right before it goes into the main part of the gantry. And cut off your excess zip tie. And I'm not going to install the other one just yet, because it's going to be hard to put the bearings in there once I have that already installed. But I can show you how I wired it in just a second. What I'm going to do with the wire is, once it's through that part, then you want to run it. There's another hole right here. You run it through here, run it into that hole. Again, you can do this with the red and white wire that's supplied with it, and then it will come up through the home switch hole. Now, you always want to label them so you can put them in later. You can use a piece of tape with a marker or a pen or something like that. I've been using a label maker. So that's going to be And you can do it however you want to, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to do H, X, 1 for, wait, do H, S, X1. And what you do if you're using a label maker, put it in there twice with a few spaces in between, and then you print. So I put HSX1 for home switch X1. Cut it, or however, if you're using a piece of tape and a pen. When I assembled my E4, I just used painter's tape and a pen. These are going to be a little bit longer and harder to keep track of, so I decided to do it a little differently. But towards the end, and if you want to put it on your switch, if you still have it connected, just put it on one side and fold it over. Make sure it's on there nice and good, and you'll be able to read which one that is. Alright, so I'm going to show you how I'm splicing in my security wire to the wires that came with the BobsCNC. So this is my X2 switch I haven't done yet. So this is how it comes. These are a little bit closer. What I do is I pull them apart a little bit to give me a little bit more room to work with, and so it's going to be flush. I just pull them over like that, and so I know that's going to be the way it's in the machine. And to line it up, I just kind of gauge it on where I want to cut it, just so I have enough to work with. So that's about good, because I don't want it to go too far into where the hole is. And then take a pair of wire cutters and cut both of them at the same time at the same spot. And I've been collecting these and putting them in a separate box because I'm going to use the connectors on the other end to connect them to the actual board, the controller. Alright, so after you do that, you have to strip these. I have a wire stripper that comes in really handy. You can use wire cutters also to strip them. And the security wire, I take a little bit more off so we have room to put the solder sleeves on. So you strip some off and you'll have this metal stuff. That's the actual shielding that protects it from interference from other electronics and cables and all that kind of stuff. So it's just kind of like foil wrapped around them. So once you pull those off, I twist them all together, use a pair of wire cutters, and cut off the excess shielding. So after you do that, we're going to need some of this wire exposed too, so you strip a little bit on that one. Alright, and so these are the solder sleeves. I'll post a link in the description. I got it from somebody on Bob's forums. But it comes in this box of a bunch of different sizes. All you really need for this whole build is the red one though. They're fairly cheap and come in very, very handy. So the way it works is you slide it over the wire, and then I didn't strip enough off of this one. So you got to be able to put it on the wire and have access to the wires while you're working on the solder sleeve. So we'll do the black one first. So the way you start is you put the solder sleeve over the wire and slide it back so you have access to the metal part of the wire. And there's several ways to do this part. You find out whatever works for you. If you've done it your own way, that works too. What I do is I separate it into two little pieces. I separate both of them like that. So it's like two little Y's like that. And what I do is I put them together. I have the two Y's like this. I put them together like that and then twist them. So it gets a good connection. Alright, and you'll see a little metal ring in the middle of the solder sleeve. What you want to do is put that right over where the wires intersect, and then you just use a heat gun to melt it all. I've got just a cheap heat gun. You can use a lighter as well. I just use a heat gun. Alright, what you're looking for is for the center metal ring to start shrinking. Once it shrinks, it actually has solder in there that's going to melt into the wires, and you get a really solid connection. And then you do the same thing with the other side, the red wire. Make sure you put the solder sleeve on before you put the wires together, or you're just going to take them right apart. Alright, and then just like the other side, you're going to use a heat gun to melt it. So that's what it looks like at that point, and then I'm going to put heat shrink on it. Alright, so I take heat shrink and put it on the wire, slide it all the way to the end where we just put those connectors on. Again, you don't need to do this unless you're extending your wires to have the controller off of the machine. But slide them over the solder connections we just did. And use the heat gun to melt it, and that's it. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that, and then I'll put that in once I get the bearings in so I can finish up that side of the gantry. That's it for this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.